And yet they have the nerve to say that we didn't know about government or social order. The two greatest governments in the world had their roots in Native people. It's not saying too much when you realize how much everything is screwed up, but you know, we could fix it for them if they asked us. They took it from us, we could fix it for them. Because the things that they left out were that humanness. They forgot to put the humanness in. They forgot to recognize and understand natural law. Because our laws were just basic common sense instructions on how to get along with your fellow humans. That was the extent of Indian law. How do we get along with each other? Right? When we make decisions, we have three things to consider: peace, righteousness, and power. Peace, that means, is it going to preserve the peace that we have? Is it going to preserve the peace that we have with our neighbors? Righteousness, that means, is it morally correct? Is it going to cause harm to anyone? Is it going to cause harm to anything? Is it going to cause harm to our relationship with the creation? Power, that doesn't mean this, or how big your army is. Power is your future generations, your seventh generation. So I have to consider, like I mentioned, how is this going to impact on my seventh generation? Is it going to ensure clean air for my seventh generation, clean water for my seventh generation, a clean place to live for my seventh generation? Well, you look at the state of the water, you look at the radiation coming across the Pacific right now, you look at the air pollution, you look at all the pollution in the soil. We're kind of falling down on that, you know. But I'm still hoping that my seventh generation will have a clean place to live. They'll have clean air, they'll have clean water. I'm fighting hard to try and make sure of that. You know, because that's what's important, right? It's not important how much money I can make, or whether I can make more money than this guy over here, or, you know, if I can get a bigger, fancier car than you, or a bigger TV than you, or, because nobody gets out alive. You know, that doesn't mean nothing if you're not happy, if you don't love yourself, if you're not happy with your family, if your children are suffering, you know, if your children are coughing because they can't breathe the air, if your children are dying because there's no clean water to drink. You know, those are our instructions. Those are what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to learn how to get along. The only way we can do that is when we stop getting rid of this racism, you know. So you better listen up. This man's got a lot to tell you here. I like what I was seeing. But I want to slow down a little bit and maybe open up, see if anybody has any questions. Because I know there's some things I haven't touched on and some things you might be wondering about. So don't be shy. Don't worry, you can't offend me. Well, I think the whole educational structure has to be changed. Basically, it's geared towards just turning out good consumers. You know, you don't really start getting any kind of education until you get to this sort of a level. You know, and also, you want your kids to learn good. It's got to be fun. Still, schools take the fun out of learning. You know, little humans are sponges. This guy's 4 years old and we're walking down the street and he's explaining to me about black holes and what a black hole is and how a black hole works. He's 4 years old. He's explaining to me about this stuff because he saw it on a show that interested him. And he liked the way they were talking about it and presented it to him, and he just absorbed it. You know, kids are like that. When they get into those school systems, they start shutting down because the schools take the fun out of it. I said, you know, the creator knows. They're supposed to have fun. They're not going to learn nothing if they ain't having fun. They shut down. So they got to start putting that, they got to change the whole system. They got to make it fun. They got to start understanding how little humans work, because they forgot. I guess I remembered because I got out of school, and that's when I started learning again. I used to enjoy learning until I started school. Right? Kids are natural learners until they start school. What happens with that? It must be something going on. They got to change that whole structure. They're not having fun. When kids are having fun, they absorb everything around them. That's why we let our kids go to meetings if we're having meetings. It might look like those kids are just playing around and not paying any attention, but parents probably understand this. They're absorbing everything they hear. If you got kids, you know that, because they'll come up to you a couple of weeks after you were having a conversation with somebody and say, well, how come you said this? Or why did Auntie so-and-so talk about, right? And you thought they weren't paying attention. She knows, right? They got to let kids be kids. That's the kind of educational system that... I watched a program not too long ago on, I can't remember if it was Iceland or Greenland. They start the school later in the day. They don't go to school as long, they only go to school for half a day, and they don't go to school for as long during the year. But their academic marks are way up higher than anywhere else. Meanwhile, over here, they're thinking is that, well, they got to go to school longer and earlier, and that's how we're going to turn out good, smart kids. But here's a place their kids are going to school later, not staying as long and not going for as long, and they're coming out smarter. I think it's because they must be having more fun. You're having fun, you learn a lot better and you learn a lot easier. And especially for our peoples, we don't absorb the same way. I could read a book on something and not understand it. Now this man's got a good way of speaking. If he got up and he spoke on the subject, I would be able to absorb everything he said. That's how we learn that way a lot better. That's how I learned, was by listening to elders speak, by listening to people speak. And then I took it a step further. Well, I want to talk about these things. So I started listening to, this man, I like the way he speaks, that works. This doesn't work the way this guy is speaking. This guy, the way he's presenting this, it works. This guy, it's a little bit, We learn like that. We learn a lot better when we're interested in something and when we have our own pace. I can sit down and I can get interested in a subject and I can study that subject for days. If I was sitting in a classroom setting, I'd probably only be able to put up with about 10 minutes of it, And it's got nothing to do with the school or anything itself. It has to do with the structure and the way things are being presented. You guys are lucky. You got a good way to do things here. We can all see each other. There's no one behind you, right? So it's a good way to learn, because you can feed off of each other. You can see each other too. You sit in a circle like this. Well, it's almost a circle. Lopsided circle. But I don't know if that helps or. Okay. Any other questions?
In terms of health services, can you tell us more about that in relation to Aboriginal people? Because I've heard that it's up north, they don't have much services and people to work for them. So.
Well, yeah, the further north you go, because there's some communities the only way in is to fly in, unless it's winter time, and then you can go in across the ice with a 4-wheeler or a dog team, or there are those kinds of remote communities, and it's hard to get services like that. But across the board, they're even cutting down on what services were allowed under Indian Affairs. I used to be able to get a prescription for lactose pills, because it's well known that Native people are lactose intolerant. And now Indian Affairs no longer covers those. So they're really cutting back on a lot of things like that. And so that's some of the things that we're talking about. You know, we're not allowed to start being more productive and sharing in the resources of the land. Then they shouldn't be cutting back those sorts of services, you know. And we should be getting a share of all. That's our coal, that's our oil, that's our nickel, that's our gas, that's our timber, that's our water. And yet we're the poorest people. We should be the richest people in the country, to my estimation, you know. Canada's main business is resource exportation, and all those resources come off of Indian land. And yet with all that wealth, well, he gave you the statistics, you know. And so there's another inequity that some peoples are fighting and struggling for. My own struggle has been a little different, you know. I mean, I'm in solidarity with every other person that's doing that, but me, it's been about sovereignty. You know, it's been about liberation. I don't want equal rights. I don't want civil rights. I'm not part of this civility. Civilization means the art of building cities. It has nothing to do with moral, intellectual, or spiritual development or evolution. It simply means the art of building cities. That city is an artificial, man-made environment which is then forced to exploit the natural world and peoples around it to maintain its existence and growth. I'm one of those natural peoples that's standing in the way, you know? So how can civil rights apply to me? I'm not part of that. I don't want to be part of that. And then equal rights. I don't want to be equal to be a judge and harass people and beat people over the head and arrest them. Or a cop. I don't want to be equal to be a judge and send people to prison. I don't want to be equal to be an MP and pass repressive laws and high taxes. I want those people to come sit in the lodge in the dirt with me and be equal to me. I want them to be more equal to that humanness. You know, because that's what's going to take care of things. That's what's going to take care of people. You know, North America has approximately 6% of the world's population. North America utilizes over 65% of the world's resources. 6% of the population utilizing over 65% of the world's resources. That leaves 35% for the other 94% of the population to utilize. You put 100 people in the room, and 6 of them got so much to eat that they're throwing food on the floor, and the other 94 are starving. How long before they turn on that 6? And that's what's happened. That's why a lot of this stuff in the world, if we could just make sure everybody in the world had enough to eat, you think how many problems would start settling down. And you know, because you got a full belly, you're not as desperate. Your kids got full bellies, you're not as desperate. And we could do that. But nobody in North America is ready to give up their shit, you know. They're out there still scrambling to get more and bigger and better shit. Something else that is uniquely North American that really struck me the other day. I heard on the news that in North America, obesity is now classified as a disease. Obesity is a disease. I saw that and I said, what the heck is wrong with these people? Obesity is a disease. Well, I got the cure. Let them go live in those places like Somalia or in the Sudan where people are starving to death. That'll cure that disease. You know? The rest of the world is starving, and obesity is a disease in North America. The rest of the world is starving, and North Americans are wondering whether to call Jenny Krager Weight Watchers in the morning and how to deal with their anorexic and bulimic kids at night. Those are uniquely North American. And they represent something that's wrong. There's something wrong here, you know? And this is what we got to start looking at and dealing with. You know, especially with so many peoples of country coming in now that should be able to understand these things. And maybe we could start turning this around and saying, wait a minute, we got to start looking after the rest of the world too. You know? Quit wasting all that food and throwing it on the floor, and let's start making sure everybody's fed. You know? And that's going to go a long way to solving things. Any other questions?
I was just wondering what your feelings are on the subject of the celebration of Columbus Day. I was just wondering how you feel, what your feelings are.
How do you think I feel? Columbus Day.
Like, how would you suggest we change that? Because I'm not for it either.
Okay. 1977 was the first United Nations sponsored conference on indigenous peoples. 1977. And that indigenous delegation at that time posted a proclamation, and they held the first International Day of Solidarity with Indigenous People on Columbus Day. And their proclamation and their suggestion was that every indigenous peoples around the world start celebrating Solidarity Day with Indigenous peoples on Columbus Day. Now, we tried to carry that out here, 84, right? 84, we had a walk to Canada, the Red People's Long Walk. It wasn't all the band councils and it wasn't all the big political Indians, it was the grassroots. It was a bunch of ragtag, scarving Indians with holes in our jeans that were walking across to Native communities and talking about these issues and bringing these issues to Ottawa. We walked into Ottawa and we charged Ottawa with genocide. We not only did that, but we got Mayor Marion DeWar of Ottawa to issue a proclamation recognizing October 12th as International Day of Solidarity with Indigenous Peoples. We also got Mayor Art Eggleton of Toronto to do the same thing. We got Mayor Art Eggleton to do it the year after too. It was something that we tried to help disseminate and spread, but it sort of got co-opted into First Nations Day on June 21st by the AFN. But that's a whole nother subject on neo-colonialism and but that's what I think, you know. In 1492, there was a lot of stuff happening. Alexander Borgia became Pope. The Moors had gotten kicked out of Spain finally. Over on the other side, the Ottoman Empire had kicked the Crusaders out of the Middle East and had renamed Constantinople Istanbul and controlled trade to the east now. It was the year of the expulsion of Jews from Europe. They either converted to Christianity or they were expelled from Europe. All of this stuff was going on in 1492. Oh yeah, there was a guy named Columbus around too. And Columbus decided to go looking for another way to get to trading areas because now it was being controlled by the Ottomans and they were cutting them off, right? So Columbus set sail and he was looking to go and start trade. So he carried a letter of introduction to the people he wanted to trade with. You know who that letter was to? Was it to the king or emperor of India? No. It was to Kublai Khan of Cathay, which is now China. And Kublai Khan had already been dead for a while because that's who Marco Polo was dealing with in the late 1200s. So it shows what they knew. But that was the letter that Columbus carried. So if he was looking for India, why did he carry a letter to Kublai Khan of Cathay? Right? Because the myth is that Columbus thought he was in India, so we called us Indians. How could he be looking for India? I don't think there was an India in 1492. Was there an India in 1492? Oh, but not India. I think it was the English in the 1600s who named it India. So wait a minute, if they named it India in the 1600s, how could Columbus be looking for it in 1492? That math don't quite add up, you know? So maybe they're lying to me. So what else was going on? Well, let's see, Columbus lands, and he meets the indigenous peoples on those islands that he lands at. Now you got a picture. You're a bunch of Indians now, you know? You're just like me. And you see these strange vessels coming across the water. And you see some really odd-looking two-leggeds crawling up. And they're cold, and they're skinny, and are they ever pale? And they're just shivering, they're cold. Look at those poor people, they're sick. We should help those people. And they come down and they start putting blankets and robes around them and building fires and feeding them and giving them medicines for their scurvy and other diseases and trying to help them out. And so the Europeans' reaction is, oh, look, they think we're gods. They're giving us offerings. You know? And the Indians are just trying to, you know, be human and say, look, we got to help these guys out, man. They're hurting. And so Columbus, on seeing that, he goes, wow. He sees these are a very decorous and praiseworthy people. These people treat strangers even as they would members of their own family. And they give their most precious items to a stranger if he only asks. And they're so happy and peaceful. These people are surely do corpus in Deo. Do corpus in Deo is Latin. Do corpus in Deo means in the likeness of God in Latin. In Deo, translated into Spanish, becomes Indio. Into English, it becomes Indian. That's where that name came from. Not because Columbus thought he was looking for a country that didn't exist yet, but because of the treatment and the attitude that he received, and the respect that he received from the peoples. So his next statement after this was, they shall be easy to enslave. They shall be easy to enslave. And that's after we helped those poor people out. They were just shivering and pale. But another example of that racism at work. And that's when those wars against our people began. I want to ask a question. How many people saw Walt Disney's Pocahontas? Yeah? What did you think of that? Do you think that was a true story? Do you know who Pocahontas was? Do you know how old Pocahontas was? Pocahontas was a 12-year-old Indian girl who was kidnapped and raped by English. I want to say that once more. Pocahontas was a 12-year-old Indian girl who was kidnapped and raped by English. It wasn't a Walt Disney love story. We are not living happily ever after. It was probably America's first case of pedophilia. It's another example of how they twist that around. That's their racism at work there. Oh, well, we can't say that, you know. Let's say that she fell in love with the English and decided to go away with them. That makes a better story than saying she was a 12-year-old girl kidnapped and raped. You know, what if it was me? What if I went and I took a 12-year-old white girl, and would they make a love story out of it? Would I be immortalized in a, you know? But I want to tell you that because it's important you understand these myths that they're throwing at you. You know, because they're probably lying to you about your own histories too. But any other questions? It'd be necessary for a time. But I want to know, where's our school? All we've got is a little part of a second floor of a school down on Dundas Street without enough teachers and without enough funding and without enough books. Now, we've been after them for our own native way school for years. You know, not that I want to see other people get denied, but I want to see our peoples get some respect too. There's 80,000 Indian people in Toronto. You know, we've been fortunate. My son's been in the gifted program. He's been taking music, and now he's just been accepted into a special program finally that they're starting up for Native people with a focus on the arts and Native studies. So I'm hoping that's really going to work out for him. You know, because I keep putting, I got a lot of pressure on him. You know, he's got a lot to carry. He's really got to carry a burden. But I told him there has to be someone in this family that starts getting that university education. And it's important because it was denied to me. By the time it was opened up to me, I'd lost all interest or any faith in him, and I was pretty jaded, and I didn't want nothing to do with him, you know. But I do recognize the necessity of it and the opportunity that comes from it. That's why he's got that burden on him. Somebody in my family's got to be the first one.
Well,
you know?
You're teaching that one right now.
Yeah. But I want him to run it. Any other questions?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if like recently there was an issue where the Native people asked for like health supplies to be like sent up north, and then our government instead sent body bags.
Mm-hmm. That's
as
about.
a response, and then there was a huge issue around that, and then finally a lot of other people stepped in and started sending supplies. Like, could you explain on that, or your opinion on that?
My opinion is basically that it's about par for the course, you know, which is why I keep talking about sovereignty. You know, I want to be in a position to be able that we can look after ourselves and not have to depend on them. But that means resources. That means Canada's finally, you know, those treaties talked about that the resources of the land were supposed to be shared. But meanwhile, Canada and Canadians are getting rich, and our peoples are still living in third world conditions. There hasn't been very much sharing. You know, even just a little bit. You'd be surprised what our people can do with little. You know, we can do a lot. Nita knows the stuff I've pulled off with nothing. Never mind if I had a little bit of money to work with. You know, and that's all it would take, is that ability for us to be able to start dealing and start looking after ourselves in those ways.
So why would the government respond in such a way, like by sending body bags?
Lack of conscientiousness, racism, they're idiots. I mean, to me, that it's been par for the course, you know. I mean, one of the things that really started upsetting me and getting me involved that things had to change was some of the things I read about when I was a 15, 16-year-old young man. I remember reading about 3 different instances where a child had to be taken from a northern community by a helicopter or airplane or something to a hospital because they were sick. The child dies, the parents aren't even informed, And there were a couple of instances where they had the RCMP return the baby's body, nobody home, and they leave it in the woodshed and the dogs get a hold of it. Can you imagine how those parents felt? And this was common practice. You know, and there were no changes, and no matter how much. If things didn't start changing until the 70s, we started seeing some pretty dramatic changes. But there was a reason for that. That's because in the 70s, there were a few young guys like myself and some sisters. We started standing up and we started taking over Anishinaabe Park, or we started blocking a pass in BC. And it was unheard of that we would do things like that. And when they started seeing that we were standing up and we were saying, hey, we're not going to allow you to hurt our people anymore, that's when things started to change. You know? And it's sad, but that's what has to happen. You never enter into confrontation unless there is no negotiation. But sometimes confrontation is necessary for negotiation to begin, and that's what we found is with them. I mean, I can walk down the street and I can walk up to a black man, brown man, yellow man, red man. I can stick out my hand, I can say, hey brother. They're going to look at me and they're going to say, hey brother. I walk up to a white man and he's going to start thinking he can steal my wallet. You know, that's if he even notices me. To me, it's like I got to crack him upside the head before he goes, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. You know, and that's been our experience. Not that they're bad people, but they're pretty darn hard-headed about, you know, their own ethnocentricity. And I hate to say that. If I offend anybody, let me apologize. If I offend any Christians, you have to forgive me. It's the rules. Oh, did I answer your question on Columbus? Because I can talk a whole bunch about that stuff. You know, even in the language, how some of that language works, right? I talked about civilized, what civilization means. Civilization is just the art of building cities. When I was growing up, they told me I had to become more sophisticated. I didn't know what they were talking about, so I looked up that word, sophisticate, to alter or change from a pure form to another. Well, I like my natural self.
I just wanted to ask how you had a colonized name and why you don't just use your real name.
How easily does Hunadahare roll off your tongue?
But at least, like, why you're, I don't know, did your mom choose to give you a colonized name, or was she forced to give you?
Well, it was more or less force is how things were done, you know. And the last names, how the last names would come about would be they're lining up and the treaties are being signed, and, you know, maybe rations are being handed out. So here comes a man with his family and they say, what's your name? And they say, well, Hinandahare. Okay, you'll be John Davis, your wife will be Mary, and your kids will be Bob and Sue. You know, that's how those names would come about. In some places, maybe the names were French. Or in some cases, maybe the name would be passed on as a family name, like out west. You have family names like Calf Pipe and Shot Both Sides and No Ear and, you know, things like that. But that's because somebody had that name who was around at that time, and so they said, okay, well, so-and-so whose name translates as Shot Both Sides, we'll name you Jim Shot Both Sides, your wife will be Mary Shot Both Sides, and so on. But that's how the names would come about like that. My father's name was James Mason, so they named me James Mason Jr. And it wasn't until later when I found my way back to the Longhouse, and they gave me that wampum to swear my pledge to my people, that they gave me my Mohawk. You know, but that's why I refer to Jay Mason as my colonizer. And some people do that, but it gets really hard for, you know, because some of our names are really hard to pronounce. Mine's one of the easier ones. Wait till you get to, I remember one brother, his name's Ghetto. And the way it's spelt, people would always come up and ask, is Kakarakaron around? Because you look at how it's spelled, so they try to go, you know, but it's Ghetto. But the way it's spelled, they were calling them Kakarakaron. But that's why it's easier for me just to say, you can call me Jay. If you can say Yonandahare, that's cool too. I answer to that. Anyone else? Okay, we're through with Columbus, you sure?
Perhaps I mean, what was it, 3-4 years ago or so, that the federal government apologized for the residential schools. Be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I said all those things that happened in those residential schools. You know, it was like a slap in the face just for them to say, oh, well, we're sorry. You know, there was my brother Jimmy Dick. He called me up when that happened. He said, hey, Jay, hey, bro, did you hear? I said, what? He said, the Prime Minister just apologized for the boarding schools. I said, you're kidding, really? He said, yeah. I said, oh. I said, well, do you feel better? He said, no. You know, apology without atonement don't mean nothing. It's just an excuse to do it again. Right? There's been no atonement. You know, there's been no national acknowledgement on that this was wrong, that Canada committed war crimes. Just saying we apologize for the boarding schools. That's, to me, it's just trying to pacify. And I don't like being pacified. That walk I told you about, when we walked in and we charged Canada with genocide, we went and we talked to the Council on Catholic Bishops. You know, we wanted to ask them what their feelings were on this issue, and also that we had about 150 people in Ottawa, and we were hoping that maybe they could open up one of their many spacious, rich church basements, just so we could roll out sleeping bags on the floor. That's all we asked them for. And their response was that they weren't in a position to do anything for us because they'd already spent so many millions of dollars bringing the Pope over for us. And my response was, we refuse to be placated with pious patronizing platitudes from pompous paternalistic persons. And I made that up on the spot. And when I said that, my bros are standing beside me and they're looking at me, they're going, Jay, say it again, say it again. It was funny, they never heard anything like that. They were getting a kick out of it. You know, but there has to be a little bit more than just an apology, you know. There has to be little Indian kids getting up safe and having enough to eat, and having a warm house to live in, and, you know, a good place to go play and learn. You know, things like that. I'll take that in place of an apology. Until that happens, the apology don't mean nothing. Does that explain it?
No, absolutely.
Any other questions? Anybody mad at me? How are we doing on time?
We have time for one more question. I think people have it.
Anybody have a question? Anybody have a question for JJ? His real name is Amos, which means small honeybee, little honeybee. Don't say that. You're going to make his face red. Gee. But it's a very strong name. Right? For Native people, if somebody says your name is small this or little that, that means that you're going to grow. That's what that means when they say that. It means that there's a lot of potential, you know. And also, Bees are really good hard workers. You know? So that's what that's why that medicine man gave him that name, because he saw that. There's greatness, and he's going to be a hard worker. But also like that bee, sometimes he's going to be bouncing off the window, you know. And also, he can sting. So, it's a very strong name that my son has. Anybody else? I'm going to sit down and.
It sounds like he had 7 years of fun. You know, it's a lot of hard work. 7 years of bouncing off windows.
Right on.
Well, perhaps in just a way to wrap up, I'll share with you that one of the things I shared with the class in our first class is that I consider all of us learners in the environment, and that's certainly true for me throughout all our classes, and it's certainly true for me today. I've learned a great deal from what you've had to share, and I know we all have. I very much appreciate you taking the time to share this with us and family and friends, and hopefully we can carry it forward in terms of that the social change that is so desperately and so required and so just.
Big Rich. Yeah, thank you. Well, it was my pleasure. Mucho gusto.
How many times have you done this?
I don't know.
In this class, it's the second time you've joined us.
There was a time when you couldn't get me to say nothing. But there was encouragement of my elders that, you know, I was hung up about 1970, 78. I had a broken leg. I had a cast on my leg up to here. I couldn't really go anywhere or do too much. And while I'm all hung up with a broken leg, there's brothers that are constantly packing up into a car and they're heading off up to Northern California to help out with fishing wars, because federal fishing agents are trying to cut Indian fishing nets and throw Indian people in jails, or they're going up to help protect them while they fish. And they're packing up and they're heading off down to protect some sacred land from excavation in Southern California, or they're off to help out the Navajo people that are under attack on their lands. And I'm stuck with a broken leg, and I'm mad because I can't go anywhere. So my elder back then, we called him Uncle Bill Wapapa, he asked me to go to a meeting. So I went to this meeting, and I came back. And one thing I learned by that time was I had a good memory. So when he asked me what happened, I could relate almost word for word everything that happened was said at that meeting. So he sent me to another meeting. And again, I came back and I reported. But this time he asked me, he said, well, what do you think? So I told him what I thought about some of the things that were being said. So the next time he asked me to go to a meeting, and this time he said, you know, he said, this time I want you to tell him what you think. And then pretty soon he was sending me regular to meetings like that, and the next thing I know, he's sending me off to speak at this college because he can't go, he's got to speak at another college, and one day I ended up here. But that's how I started, you know. I already had everything in the knowledge, so I'd spend all that time just listening and learning, you know. And now you can't shut me up.
Well, we're thankful for it. Thank you very much. So that concludes our class. And if people are open to, as best as possible, putting the desks back, that would be great.